They didn't have enough information to make those critical decisions.
Where is everyone?
I know that this has to be very traumatic for the survivors.
They did the very best they could with the information they had.
You've got the best in the world, Chief. Why didn't they have that information?
Investigators believe the suspected arsonist started the fire right around this area.
Rinder Kanesh was dressed in a cream-colored jail jumpsuit, shackled.
The whole theory is that the Palisades fire was a reignition of the Lockman fire.
They're trying to prove that it's the park department's land, and they were the ones who were responsible for it. We have a deposition with a state park ranger talking about how she noticed smoldering.
We saw a lot of news conferences after the fire, a lot of promises made.
The LAFD is understaffed, under-resourced, and underfunded.
There's a very deep feeling in me of regret that I wasn't there.
An independent report seems like it's needed in both areas.
Right, the goal is an accurate report. People have seen over the past year incrementally advancements in the investigation into both fires, but it's hard to figure out where we are now and how close we are to understanding how these fires started.
Yeah, the lawsuits are, I think, going to be our best window into what's happened. Ultimately, I think, as advocates for the public, what I'm trying to find out is whose decisions led to these situations. Whether it was a decision not to refill a reservoir, a decision not to put firefighters at a particular place, a decision to make changes on deployments ahead of these fires. I think what we're really after is some accountability for who's responsible for all of this.
Let's start with Palisades. Fundamentally, the fire that burned that community did not start on January 7th.
Well, that's the conclusion of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They concluded that the January 7th fire was a reignition of a much smaller brush fire, the Lockman fire, that burned in the Palisades Highlands on January 1st. Firefighters managed to stop its progress and fully extinguish the visible flames by the next morning. A dozen or so acres burned, no homes damaged.
So we thought perhaps it was extinguished. What happened?
The sense of it is that the visible flames were extinguished from the January 1st fire, but that the ground continued to smolder. And the ATF believes that even though there were no visible flames, in reality, some of the root systems from some of the plants that burned above ground were still hot. And when the intense winds took off on January 7th, they provided enough fresh oxygen, even underground, that it caused those roots to reignite and the much more destructive, much larger fire to start. And one of the big questions is what happened in those 4 or 5 days after the fire had been put out, but before the Palisades fire ignited.
Let's talk a little bit about that drone video that was shot by one of the neighbors who ultimately lost his home.
So we know that there is a number of different video excerpts shot by different members of the public, and recently one came to light that was shot by a resident of Pacific Palisades on January 1. And that shows the southern end of the Lockman fire burn scar, which is exactly where the ATF said the Palisades fire ignited 6 days later. And this drone video shows very clearly smoke continued to pour out of the ground in greater volume than any of the other videos that have been released. This is something that surfaced very recently.
And you also mentioned there's some infrared technology that can be used for this?
Right. The video also includes some infrared, which shows surface level soil temperature. You can just see the red all over the infrared. That entire burn scar, the surface is still very hot.
So LA City Fire was responsible for addressing that fire, but it also burned into the California State Park system, did it not?
It did, but one of the incredibly complicated issues in Southern California is establishing which firefighting agency has responsibility for which land. The State Parks Department doesn't have its own fire department that's capable of fighting a large brush fire. The responsible agency is the LA City Fire Department.
Right, but there's been some controversy that suggests that state park officials on scene tried to address the firefighting effort as to protect certain protected shrubbery or vegetation. Is there any evidence to that?
It is 12:15 p.m. We're on the record.
So did you have any interaction with these firefighters either before or during their activities that are shown in this photograph about your request to cover the trail with brush?
Yes.
You have a state parks biologist who is talking to firefighters, and there are images of these state parks employees talking with firefighters. The attorneys are saying he is telling them to go ahead and put dried brush back on containment lines that had been cut.
He saw this containment line that the firefighters had dug to create a barrier of soil so that you didn't have fire spreading. He went to them and told them to go put the dry brush back on the containment line. So if you know...
Essentially to protect hikers in the area or people walking.
Put up a trail closed sign or put some yellow tape up if you're worried about it. They dug that for a reason. Let it be.
Yeah, I made the request that we pull in some of the cut vegetation.
So the firefighters were taking the brush that they had cut to make the containment line that was pushed away from the fire and dragging it back over the containment line to cover it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You have state park employees who are talking very openly about what was going on during and after the Lockman fire. And we have a deposition with a state park ranger talking about how she noticed smoldering.
Based on your observations when you hiked up and took photos on January 1st, you said you saw evidence of smoldering still occurring. Did that not cause you to think that the park should be closed to members of the public?
I did not believe it was necessary to close the park.
Even though you saw evidence of smoldering, correct?
Correct.
Did you communicate your observations of smoldering to anyone else in state parks?
No.
The state park rangers are not the ones out there doing firefighting, but they are out there sort of speaking with firefighters, talking to them about endangered plants or zones that need to be avoided.
There's actually a manual that lays out firefighting techniques that are approved by the state and areas, mapped out areas that are sensitive for a variety of reasons.
Well, we were told by the state park reps that we deposed, the black boxes were added by the state park's lawyers to block out what are considered archaeologically significant sites. The red circles on the avoidance map indicates the presence of protected plant species.
The state now says the Lockman fire was not in an area marked as an avoidance area, nor even that close to those areas. But the ATF's map showing the Lockman fire burn scar does appear to contain avoidance areas, and text messages shown in recent court filings exchanged between state parks employees on January 1st indicate environmentally sensitive plants were a concern. There is an endangered plant population and a cultural site in the immediate area. And so I imagine they are cutting at least some astragalus with those hand crews.
This plant is a threatened species, and they take it very seriously. Homeowners have also pointed out to me that since everything was decimated between the Lockman fire and the Palisades fire, the plant doesn't exist out there anymore.
You can't explain it. No one has yet been able to explain it to anybody. Lost 12 lives here. 12 people died. The first thing you expect out of any government entity is public safety. And public safety did not happen in the Pacific Palisades. And it's proven that it didn't happen. And when you look at the video, like honestly, like a 5-year-old could have said, hey, that's burning, or that's smoldering.
It's still smoldering.
My family and I waited a long time to decide we're not litigious by nature. I joined this lawsuit because people that are responsible for public safety need to be held accountable. That's the part I think that is the most insulting for all of us, was to just, do one of these and say it's them, it was their fault, it was their fault. It's everybody's fault. And the righteous thing to do is to step up and say, you know what, we made a mistake.
What are your biggest challenges legally as you try to sort of hone in on the failings of the Parks Department?
Well, the biggest challenge in any claim against any government entity is the immunities. And so there are some things that the law simply won't allow you to challenge, firefighting being one. But in this case, the case against the state has nothing to do with firefighting. That's not the focus. It has to do with the state's duties to the public as a landowner.
The state says no one from state parks interfered with any firefighting activity, suppression, or mop-up, nor influenced LAFD's decision to not use bulldozers as part of the firefighting response to the Lockman fire.
But it's not clear what happened. The people that know the most about it are the firefighters who were there at the Lockman fire, both on the night that it was fought initially and on the days following, and the state parks officials who were sent to the scene to monitor what was going on. Some of the city firefighters who were there have been ordered to sit for depositions, but those haven't happened because the firefighters, who were initially being represented by attorneys from the LA City Attorney's Office, have now asked for their own independent lawyers to represent them in those depositions. So those have been delayed.
A year from now, in looking at the Palisades, how much do you think we will know as to how it started and who is responsible?
Well, a few things are going to happen in 2026 that I think will give all of us a lot more visibility. First of all, in the civil case, the lawsuits that have been filed by thousands of Palisades fire victims against the city of LA, we're going to learn through the pre-trial events, discovery, documents being produced, depositions being given, exactly what people inside these departments knew and chose to do or not do around the time of both the Lockman fire and the Palisades fire. And clearly, if that fire wasn't perfectly or as extensively as possible overhauled, the implication is there was an opportunity to prevent the Palisades fire from ever starting. In the criminal case, remember, there's a person who's been charged federally with igniting the Lockman fire as an alleged act of arson. That case is moving towards trial possibly as soon as March or April. And in the presentation of evidence in that case, we will get a much clearer look into the ATF's conclusions about the mechanics of how the fire started. So not only by the end of the year, I would say in the first 6 months of 2026, we're going to have insight and information into what went on in a way that's far more detailed than anything we've known to date.
The Eaton fire started hours after the Palisades fire started. And from what we understand, it's clear that the generation of this fire came from the San Gabriel Mountains inside the Angeles National Forest and was the responsibility of Southern California Edison. It came from a high-tension power line. Is that correct?
It did, but again, it's complicated. There's no electricity in those lines, but in the videos that people recorded of the first moments of the Eaton fire, it is pretty clear that the flames were first seen beneath those decommissioned power lines.
Right. How can a dead line become energized?
My best understanding of it is that the dead lines are still electrical conductors, right? They were at one point used to carry electricity, so they're very efficient. And in the wind, the theory is those energized lines were swinging back and forth, and even momentarily through this phenomenon called induction, the electrical field that exists around them would allow electricity to be picked up or jump into the deadlines. This video simulation, commissioned by wildfire lawyers suing Edison, shows a flash atop that tower and fires starting below. They believe that those deadlines became momentarily energized and sparked and caused the first flames of the Eaton fire to begin. Now, that shouldn't be a problem. When those lines were decommissioned and taken out of service, they were supposed to be preserved in a way that would ground any errant electricity that got into the lines. Had the dead tower at the point of origin been grounded as perfectly as it could possibly have been, that connection was solid, that would mean that any electricity that that line absorbed through induction or other ways would just become inert?
Yes, it would go. The connection would carry that electricity to ground. The problem is the poor connection, and it would be more likely than not, if the connection had been proper, then this fire would not have occurred.
And they say they have physical evidence of that, melted metal and other things around this tower where the fire started that they believe proves that. Ultimately, those lines are the responsibility of the utility.
Right, and so if the fire had started in the Palisades, we had high gusting winds, almost historic in nature. Why was that power line still energized?
There are certain thresholds that we have. Wind speed is one of them. Relative humidity is another one. Fuel moisture is another one. When you hit all of those criteria, then we'll shut off power for public safety. And on the distribution system, there are different wind thresholds than there are on the transmission system.
So there's a question as to the nature of those measurements.
Both PG&E and San Diego Gas and Electric began tracking weather conditions in near real time, getting updates once every 30 seconds. Edison's official response was that it would continue tracking weather conditions every 10 minutes, following the World Meteorological Organization's guidance.
Southern California Edison, did they deny that this was where the fire started?
Not exactly. From early on, the Edison has been filing documents with the state regulators, speaking to its investors, which ultimately may look at shouldering the liability costs related to the fire, and said that they believe it's likely that Edison equipment, in one way or another, caused the ignition of the fire.
While the investigation is ongoing, based on currently available information, it is likely that SCE equipment could have been associated with the ignition of the Eaton fire. Induction of the idle line remains a viable explanation. We are committed to learning from this tragedy and continuing to invest in making the system and communities safer.
Which was the responding agency to that fire?
The Los Angeles County Fire Department, along with Forest Service, and then ultimately CAL FIRE as well.
You know, in retrospect, when we look back with 2020 vision, we can always identify things that should be improved upon. But at that moment, and the most challenging day we've ever had when it comes to wildfire in Los Angeles County, everyone came together to do the best they could.
We've taken you up and down this street. Again, not a single fire engine, no fire crews out here. We have seen them spread thin throughout the entire city, but this is one neighborhood, one pocket where we have not been able to spot a single fire engine.
We were operating at the Palisades fire, the Eaton fire, and then finally the Hearst fire that occurred at 10:30 in the San Fernando Valley. We were stretched. We had no more personnel or apparatus to give.
Let's talk about evacuation. There has been criticism that evacuations didn't take place soon enough. What's your feeling on that in retrospect?
Retrospectively, I understand why people wish that it had occurred earlier, but the information the incident commanders had at that time, at that moment, they didn't have enough information to make those critical decisions.
You've got the best in the world, Chief. Why didn't they have that information? So I'm clear.
Yeah, I think that we were outpaced, we were overwhelmed. The speed with which this fire was moving through the community, all of the different directions, that unprecedented ember cast, which was traveling downwind for 1 to 2 miles, starting new structure fires that we weren't aware of. It was a very, very difficult situation, but I know from speaking with them that they did the very best they could with the information they had at the time.
Right, so there was an after-action report at the county level. A lot of people were not satisfied with it.
Not at all. In fact, they're saying that some things were missing in there, including the emergency alert system and why certain alerts went to one part of Altadena and not the other. Every person but one that died, there are 19 souls that were lost in the Altadena fire, were on the west side of Lake Avenue that did not get alerts until 9 to 10 hours after the east side did. That is based on, according to the after action report, a software and sort of a demarcation line that was reviewed, not actually boots on the ground talking about what was going on.
This report leads to more questions than answers, and quite frankly, a lot of anger.
It did not identify one single failure to how the alerts, warnings, notifications, and evacuations were conducted, but a series of weaknesses, including outdated policies, inconsistent practices, and communications vulnerabilities. Honestly, Sheriff Luna, in the first meeting after the first after action report, said something to the effect of, we're not ready for the next one, and raising red flags even then. Months after the fires themselves, there are certain things that really need to happen with how communities are alerted, the type of messaging that's happening, and how quickly we put those into place if there were to be another wildfire or any other emergency for that matter.
These men and women were just not only risking their lives, they're just doing it on instinct, trying to figure out what houses, what block to go to, whether it was in their cars pushing the siren on the PA, doing door knocks, literally taking people out of their houses. That's what they were out there doing just continuously, if I paint that picture for you.
Had the Palisades fire not started, the county fire department would have had more people available closer to deal with the Eaton fire. But much like in the Palisades fire, from everything we've heard from people in the department and fire experts who've been retained by the families who've lost homes in the Eaton fire and are now filing these lawsuits, they also believe this was a generational event of such intensity that even 10,000 more firefighters might not have made any difference.
You know, our air operations section is world-renowned. Our pilots drop water day and night, and to not have those aerial resources, the night here as hills and into these communities, it was like fighting a fire with one hand tied behind her back.
So the controversy was that, among other things, that there weren't enough firefighters, and plus there was a reservoir that LADWP that was empty, that had funneled, from what we understand, it was responsible for funneling water to the hydrants in that neighborhood, and those hydrants went dry. How much of a role did that play in what we saw?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. The reservoir you're talking about is the Santa Ynez Reservoir, which is a drinking water reservoir, which is an important piece of the puzzle here, that serves the west side of Los Angeles. But it doesn't produce water to fire hydrants directly. The Santa Ynez Reservoir holds millions and millions of gallons when it's full, but that water is then pumped uphill to a variety of storage tanks, which hold about 1 million gallons each, and those tanks are what directly serve the communities of the Palisades and, in turn, the fire hydrants.
By not having the water in the reservoir, a couple things happened. One, you didn't have the benefit of 170 million gallons of water. And two, when they designed Santa Ynez Reservoir back in the late 60s, it was designed with the reservoir being filled so that it provided pressure to the whole system so that the pumps would work and it would be able to lift water uphill and so forth. When you take that water out, you drop the pressure so low that when you start opening hydrants, you start to see a drop in the pressure, and then the 3 1 million gallon tanks that did have water in them ran out within hours.
He doesn't have any water.
The LA Department of Water and Power has done its own research into what went on. It hasn't produced a final report, but what's been discussed in its board and oversight meetings is that not only were firefighters drawing the water out of those supply tanks, but as each home burned down, it left what's in essence an open spigot as water supply lines melted away. And it was really the drain of both the firefighting and all of these empty taps, which, we're talking about thousands of properties here, that caused those supply tanks to drain faster than they could be refilled.
The San Ynez Reservoir was drained, so those helicopters then had to fly much greater distances and costing more time to get water. And we calculated, I think, in excess of 5 hours of lost time in the air, traveling further distances than they would have if San Ynez was filled.
At this point, it's kind of a what if. The lawyers representing Palisades fire victims believe it's a major factor. So far, what we've heard from the DWP is that it's unclear. Possibly it wouldn't have made a difference at all because they say they had an alternative water supply.
We're fighting a wildfire with urban water systems, and that is really challenging.
The state of California is also looking into this independently, and that's another area where we're really hoping to have some clearer answers in the coming months.
At the time, there was much attention paid to the fact that the mayor of Los Angeles was out of country in Africa.
I've been in direct communication with Mayor Bass, who's on her way home from a diplomatic mission on behalf of the United States government.
How difficult was it for you to respond to this after the Africa trip debacle?
Well, I mean, that was tough, and I remember us talking about it, and the only way I can describe it is how you might feel if you are out of town when a member of your family or somebody that is close to you has an accident or is ill and you're not there. It doesn't matter why you were out of town, and it doesn't matter where you were. What matters is you weren't there when you were needed. And that is a very deep feeling in me of regret that I wasn't there. Obviously, had I known and the city been better prepared, that wouldn't have been the case. But regardless, I wasn't here. And so that's why I do understand the anger and all, but what's going to get Palisades rebuilt? What is going to move the city forward? Is that going to be helpful? Or if what's helpful is expediting everything I possibly can to help the housing be rebuilt and families restored?
So the Los Angeles Fire Department for years considered themselves as the premier fire department in the country. What damage has been done to the reputation of this department, do you think?
I'm not sure the Palisades fire can be blamed for the issues that face the LA City Fire Department today in ways that they haven't before, but it's certainly the most visible of the issues.
I don't think the fire department has been properly resourced for decades. One thing that has happened in our city over many decades is that if you look at the fire resources that we have now in terms of engines and stations, it's the same number we had when there were far fewer people in the city of Los Angeles. And that holds for our entire infrastructure.
Were you shocked when the fire chief, within days of that fire in the Palisades, confessed that the city let the residents down because the city had let down the department?
No.
It is my job as a chief to make sure that my firefighters are funded appropriately, are equipped appropriately, and they're trained appropriately. That's why I'm here.
We knew right after the Palisades fire that just a month before it burned, the fire chief was in one of these oversight meetings begging for more money in the city budget and talking about all the things that had to be cut or reduced, including things that became issues in the response to the Palisades fire because there just wasn't enough money being allocated to the fire department.
What is your hope that the lessons of what happened on January 7th will be learned and that the city and the county will advance from this to a point where it will be a safer place to live?
Well, in both of these fires, without even having the full picture today, we can see that there were decisions made that had terrible, terrible outcomes. The more we learn about the potential for these, Given the number of wildland fires in the state of California that have been horribly destructive, that have been caused by electrical anomalies of all kinds, and holdover fires or zombie fires have been blamed for all kinds of fires in the state, including one just before the Palisades fire. It would really surprise me if this did not lead to some really strict rules that some lawmaker, either at the city, the county, the state, would really focus in on making that not possible in the future, in places where they know there's a risk that's far higher than almost anywhere else.